Now comes the fun part, where each of the panelists will have an opportunity to ask a question of the opposing side. Gayle Smith, you get the first question.
Your motion suggests that there is causality between aid and the continuation of poverty in Africa, sort of like saying there's a mortgage crisis in the United States, and I don't know, therefore we should get rid of banks. And my question is, are you suggesting that aid is the tool that is ultimately responsible for the eradication of poverty in Africa? George, when you say that Africans want reform, 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 and you support a motion that says aid is doing more harm than good, are you suggesting that aid is the tool that's going to bring about reform? My question boils down to wanting to understand whether you're giving aid far more potency than it actually ever could have or indeed should have.
William Easterly?
Yes. Okay. Thank you. What I was talking about is aid and economic growth. The expectation of the aid advocates was that aid would be invested and would create economic growth. That is, a steady rise in living standards of the poor population and would gradually lead them to exit from poverty. And that is what has not happened. There's been aid but zero growth. Now, John called this a spurious correlation. Now, if any of you really do want to get tortured by economists, I could try to give you some explanations of how economists deal with spurious correlations.
I was actually referring more to the difference between Ethiopian shootings and aid.
We have methods for dealing with correlations. We control for lots of other factors. We deal with causality, which is causing which. And at the end of the day, the answer is pretty much the same, that aid does not generate economic growth. That was its promise. That promise it has failed to keep.
But if I may just very quickly, I consider myself one of those advocates. I have never, ever presumed that economic growth was going to come about in Africa because of aid alone. And I think the fault underlying your motion is that presumption. And I think what this side of the table would argue is that aid is one of those tools and that it is having an increasingly positive impact, but that there are multiple other tools that must be brought to the table. There are the terms of trade. There are world market prices. There is governance. There is ending conflict. There is the arms trade. There is climate change. There are any host of other factors that must be brought to bear if you want to reduce poverty in Africa.
George Ayittey, her initial question was to you. Did you want to respond briefly?
Yeah. I think in her beginning paragraph statement, she made a very interesting observation, and that is the complexity of this issue. You know, the way the question itself is framed doesn't really allow us to address that. And the fact of the matter is, look, I personally believe that Africa doesn't need aid. And I have stated this, that Africa's begging bowl leaks horribly. I mean, you pour in aid, it just leaks out. Number one, corruption. Take the amount of aid which goes into Africa every year. The total from all sources, $25 billion. Compare that to the leakages. $148 billion in corruption lost. $80 billion in capital flight out of Africa every year. Okay? How much money do African governments spend on the military and to purchase weapons? Okay? $15 billion. How much does Africa spend a year to import food? $20 billion. Back in the 1960s, Africa not only fed itself, it exported food. Okay? If we are able to plug all these leakages, we'll find more than enough money than the double the aid that Tony Blair and Bono and Sachs want to give to Africa. Okay? That's my position. But aid has become an industry, replete with its own lobbies. Okay? They want that to continue because aid, if you ask George Soros, he will tell you that aid benefits the donors more than the recipients. They would like to have this and continue, okay? What to do? All right, this is where I say that if you want to ask the Africans, ask them what type of help they need. And this is why I believe that the mechanism that we have today is not working. It has to be reformed so that it benefits those that it is intended to do.
worry, just as a historical reading, and would ask you at least to consider the possibility that the argument you're making is the argument that the justifiers of aid have made pretty much every 10 years since basically the 50s, since the era of decolonization. And I mean, this is actually not a polemical question. I'd like to know why you think this time it's not simply, as George says, a question of interest, but that one can actually legitimately say that the present of aid is different from all its various paths.
It's a great question. I'm glad you raised it, David. I think the point I was trying to make is that it's probably not a good use of our time to talk about something that happened in 1975 when our premise is, our question is aid doing more harm than good? So that's my basic point. We can sit here and play armchair quarterback over 1980, 1984, any year, 1962. There's all sorts of stories. And when we turn on the news every night, we'll hear about the latest car crash. I mean, that's the way these storytellings work. The reason I wanted to focus on the numbers is because I think the numbers tell a very different story. Professor Ayittey asked the question, well, what do Africans want? Well, in my conversations, quite sincerely with Africans in rural areas where, of course, we have to keep in mind just how poor rural Africa is. These are places where they're lucky to see $50 of cash in a year in a family. They're living, the imputed value of the economy is estimated as maybe $200 per capita in the poorest countries. They want, when I talk to them, fertilizer, bed nets, clean water, functioning clinics. They want very practical things. And actually, George Soros is supporting work to provide that, quite specifically. So I think it's important that we keep in mind what the amount of resources is that's put into this. The U.S. all-time U.S. foreign aid, because we've talked a little bit about the U.S., is about $48 billion to Africa, all-time, since 1961. If you take out the food aid, of course, which is paying American farmers and shipping companies. That's about $2.50 per African per year. It's a very small amount of money. And I don't know what you expect to buy for that. And just for context, $48 billion is, of course, about half of what is spent in 1 year in Afghanistan and Iraq. Politics aside, to me, that's the comparison of a priority and not a priority in broad political terms. So I'd be all too elated if we were sitting here talking about fertilizer, bed nets, antiretrovirals, which programs worked, which ones didn't. I think we're seeing that for $30 per person from all the rich countries all around the world to Africa, we're getting about what we pay for.
And John MacArthur, you get the next question.
My question is actually to the other side, is saying for $30 per capita per year, compared to, and I just use the past few years as a reference point, 1.3 million people on antiretrovirals, 20 percentage point increase in primary enrollment, 360,000 children a year, lives saved from measles, and all the other practical programs we've heard of, what would be success? What would be, we already heard, that's good, not harm. What would be satisfactory for $30 per capita? Because I don't know how much you can buy with that money.
Professor Ayittey.
Let me respond briefly to John, and that is, it is true you pointed out these success stories, but to me, these success stories are really cleaning up the mess that past aid programs created.
So they're doing good where there was harm.
I have been to the villages myself. We are setting up malaria-free zones in villages. I've visited villages in Benin, Ghana, Nigeria, Kenya. We give villages anti-malaria drugs, bed nets, and so forth. Everywhere that I go, the villagers tell me one thing that they tell me is this: look, governments have failed them. The government ministers come around election time to campaign canvas for their votes. As soon as the elections are over, they don't see them again. So they're asking you for bed nets, they're asking you for anti-malarial drugs because their governments have failed them.